Will someone turn the lights off, please? The first question on the test says the graph above shows the data collected from reactions at different temperatures of a substrate at pH 6. Based on the data, what results can be predicted from the temperature of 5 degrees Celsius? This has nothing to do with molecular structure. What this is testing your idea, your chapter 1 skills, the skill of analyzing a graph, of doing control groups, experimental groups. This was chapter 1, material. So when we look at this graph, we're looking, if we just looked at the best fit line, it would follow something like this. The data points are what we measured. The data points are what we measured. We did not measure the stuff on the red line. So we measured, if we did an estimate, and you saw that about half is here, this would be 10. 5 would be right there. And obviously that would be 25 or 30, that would be 50, and this is 70. So then they ask you, what would be the amount of product at 5 degrees? Well, there's no measurement at 5 degrees, but if you predict by looking at the best fit line, we would expect what? D, 0, or E, 0. So a little or no product is what we'd expect to see. The reason we graph in science, if you remember from chapter 1, is to allow us to predict. So chemical reactions taking place in a cell will most likely speed up if you didn't know that. So I gave you the answer. Remember, I told you it should have been D. I could have left it, since it's the only one that really makes sense if you paid attention to chapter 6 enzyme stuff. But I told you in class I would not test you on enzyme material, and unfortunately this is one of the questions that slipped through. 4 of those happened, so my bad. All organic compounds contain which element? This you should know. Covered in class. Carbon, correct. So the answer here is C. Is nitrogen in biomolecules? Absolutely, yeah. But it's not all biomolecules. The one that's in all biomolecules is carbon. Which of the elements are often found in organic compounds? Often found. The best answer. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Again, all these questions have to do with basic understanding of what the molecules are made of. I think we spent a lot of time talking about, and to remind you what we talked about, as I said, I'm going to, just give me a second, let me write that down. Just hold on to your question. Make sure you remember it by writing it down. So the question, were there 4 biomolecules? We talked about lipids. As somebody said, we talked about lipids a lot. And they're made mostly of carbon and hydrogen and some oxygen, but mostly carbon and hydrogen. We talked about carbohydrates and a lot. And we talked about the idea that it's mostly CHO, and it's actually 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So there's as much carbon as there is hydrogen in carbohydrates. I mean, as much as there is oxygen. Let me rephrase that. There's as much oxygen as there is carbon in a carbohydrate. That's not true of lipids. Lipids have a lot less oxygen in them. You should know that by this point. We talked about proteins. Went through the structure of proteins. We talked about the idea that carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen are in proteins. And we talked about nucleic acids, and we said there was some sulfur, by the way. And in nucleic acids, we said there's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus, and nitrogen. So you'll notice that there is nitrogen in both of these, but this is the only one that has phosphorus. And notice that there's no nitrogen in lipids or carbohydrates in general. This is what we talked about in class. If you knew that much and you remembered organic, you got most of these answers on the first page correct. And you remembered how to graph and how to use a graph to predict values. Let's take a look at the next one. Animals store glucose containing polysaccharides called what? B-glycogen. And we said that glycogen, that plants use, or animals use glycogen. We said plants use cellulose for structure. We said wax is a form of lipids, that plants actually produce wax for their leaves. Things like aloe vera is the example we used in class. Yes? You can't see? Go ahead and move over here in the front. You can move on, sit here at this bench. There's a spot right here. You can sit next to that young person there. Stanford, could you make a space? So come on over and move closer to the board. And I hope this improves the size of it as well. Long chains of amino acids should be what? Should be found in proteins. So the answer is proteins. Now, we talked about long chains, about this idea of polymers. And we talked about amino acids, and we said amino acids have a group, an acid group. See, double bond O, single bond OH, connected. Oh, that's wrong. Let me do it just so it's not wrong, but I don't want to. So it should have an amino group, NH2, and you should have a center carbon. There should be a hydrogen, some R group. And then there should be C double bond O, OH. And we said that's an amino acid. And it's an amino acid because you have, I said you have an acid group here. That's the carboxylic acid group. And I said you have the amino group here. And together they're amino acid. That's what I said. And you can link them together to form a dipeptide, a tripeptide, a polypeptide, that kind of thing. All right. So again, I think so far everything except one question was covered in class, and that one question I gave you for free. So there's no question, I don't think, on that. If there is, I wouldn't mind hearing your argument. The next question, refer to the illustration above. Molecules like B are found in proteins. Okay, so what if they're going to be nucleic acids and proteins? If they're nucleic acids and proteins, what would you find? What would you expect there to be in proteins, and what elements do you expect to see I told you this was going to be key.
Amino acids and nitrogen.
Nitrogen is in both, isn't it? Yeah. In proteins and nucleic acids. Do you see any nitrogen in either? Is there an N anywhere in that? No, there's no nitrogen. So these two are wrong because there's no nitrogen, and nucleic acids and proteins at least have to have nitrogen, must have nitrogen, must. Without it, there's no amino acid or nucleic acid. Now, what did we say? We're looking at B. We're looking at B. And we literally just said it. In fact, the previous questions told you the answer to this. Do you see in molecule B a lot of oxygen? How much carbon versus, like carbohydrates, I expect to see what? What do I expect to see in carbohydrates? In both of these, I expect to see carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That's right. In carbohydrates, I expect to see a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So I expect to see as much oxygen, an oxygen for every carbon. Let's take a look at this one. There's a carbon here, there's an oxygen there. Carbon here, there's an oxygen. Carbon here, there's an oxygen. Carbon here, there's an oxygen there. Carbon here, there's an oxygen there. Carbon here, there's an oxygen here. And carbon here, and there's an oxygen. For every one of these carbons, there's an oxygen. So that's a carbohydrate. But this one, I see a lot of carbons. I see a lot of hydrogen. Is there a lot of oxygen? Is there as much carbon as oxygen? No, so that's not a carbohydrate. It's a long chain of carbon and hydrogen. It's a lipid. That's a lipid. Yeah, I know. It's look, this is high school. You guys are just coming into high school. I get it. It's tough. It's tough. So I'm not judging you. I'm asking you to be reflective. Reflect. Which of these is not an organic molecule? So what is an organic molecule? Usually carbon bonded to other carbons. All right. So here's carbon bonded to hydrogen, right? Here's a carbohydrate. Is that an organic molecule? Yeah, because you have carbon to carbon bonds. Here, lipids, carbon to carbon bonds. Nucleic acids, carbon to carbon bonds. What about ice? What's ice? Water, which is what? H2O. There's no carbon. So no carbon, that means it's not organic. So that's the answer to that one. Does that make sense? Yeah. All right. Which of the following organic molecules is most closely related to nucleic acids?
Is it
A, because you say A amino acids has nitrogen. You're right. They both have nitrogen, so they're related. But that's not the answer because it's not the most closely related. Nucleic acids, look at the words. The words tell you it all. Nucleotide. And if you remember, and maybe you don't, I don't know, we didn't cover a lot of DNA and RNA, nucleic acids, but I said, there's one thing you need to know on the test. I said, you're going to have to know that you're going to have this structure that we're going to call ribose. You have this thing here. I'm just going to put a ring. I even said I'll put a kind of a double ring on it. And I'll say that this is going to be a nitrogenous base. And I said the difference between DNA and RNA is going to be there. One of the differences. And I said up here, it's going to be this carbon is going to be connected to a phosphate group. And we're going to call this thing, I said, a nucleotide. And if you look back at the notes or the videos, you'll see that I took a bunch of these, and I put them in a chain. And I even talked about the double helix as a general kind of introduction to a DNA or nucleic acid, right? What is going on with this, man? So I said we can connect them all together, 3' to 5', and make a chain, and that would be a nucleic acid, that any individual one would be called a nucleotide. All right? So which one of these is most closely related to nucleic acid? DNA. It's DNA, RNA, it's a nucleotide. So the nucleotide is the monomer for the polymer called nucleic acid. All right. Nucleic acids include DNA and RNAs, correct. All right, those are the two nucleic acids. All right. And the shape of a protein is determined by this one I gave you credit for. It's determined by, because I didn't think it was, even though, no, not this, I didn't give you this because I did tell to you, I knew it was hard. I told to your class, I felt you could have figured it out if you thought about it. So let's try to figure it out. Shape of proteins determined by, have we talked about cells yet? Probably not the answer then, though. I guess it could be, but it's not. It could be none of the above. We'll leave that as a question mark. Its size is a possibility, right? The size of its possibility. But look, the order of the amino acids. We talked about the idea that the amino acids have an R group, and that the R groups determine its function. I said that because there's 20 different amino acids, 20 different R groups, and the order of that R groups are going to be the big deal. So it was a tough question. If you got it wrong, I understand. But the answer is amino acids. I did give it to you in class, so I decided to hold you accountable for that. And remember that these amino acids are all connected, and they just are all connected, and that the difference between the amino acids and a polypeptide is this R group. You can go back and look at the videos or the notes that you have on it if you want to go look and verify that. All right. Here, which of the following is a carbohydrate? Well, we know it's not DNA because DNA is a what? A nucleic acid, I heard someone say, so that's not it. Insulin, I gave in class as an example of a protein. And DNA is nucleotide, or nucleic acid. I'm just going to put Na, nucleic acid. Wax, we talked about in class as being an example of a lipid. It's a lipid. And we actually talked about in class, we actually used the word, in fact, it's on your study guide. It's on your green study guide, sucrose, as an example of a carbohydrate. If you look at your green study guide or white study guide, depending on which color you got, there's literally sucrose is the example of a disaccharide. Two monosaccharides connected together. We said, I even used it in class and called it table sugar. That white sugar we call table sugar is sucrose. Polysaccharides are what? The word saccharide means what? The word saccharide, what does that mean? Well, it means sugar. All right, so a polysaccharide is multiple sugars, many sugars. And so we know proteins aren't sugars, I hope you know, right? And sugar, by the way, is a type of carbohydrate. And we know unsaturated fats are lipids. And we know lipids are not carbohydrates. So a polysaccharide is a bunch of monosaccharides or a bunch of simple sugars connected together. So the answer is A. Amino acids are units of proteins is correct. And we just talked about that. Disaccharide is what? Di means two. Di means two. What is saccharide? Sugars. So two sugars. Vocabulary, vocabulary, vocabulary. It always comes back to haunt you. And the example of the disaccharide was sucrose. So you can take two sugars. I'm just going to do a simple drawing and connect them. If there's just two of them, we call that a disaccharide. Oh, not T, D. So if you connect two different sugars, you get two different monosaccharides, you get two different disaccharides. So for instance, lactose is different from sucrose. So the sugar found in milk is different from the sugar found in table sugar. They're both sugars, they're just different because the monosaccharides that make them up are different. Question? Yes. Sign out. Take your pass. So, okay, proteins are not carbohydrates. So this proteins are made of amino acids. So disaccharides are carbs, carbohydrates. Nucleotides are nucleic acids. They're the monomer of nucleic acids. Steroids are forms of lipids. So again, the only answer that's reasonable there is proteins. Lipids are polar molecules. Is that true? You wouldn't know that, but the answer is no. So if you didn't know it, I hope you wouldn't just choose an answer because you don't know it. You should know what that is, but they're not. Similar to water molecules, protein molecules are lipids proteins? No, they are not. So you could definitely get rid of that one. Non-polar molecules. Okay. So are they similar to water molecules? Remember, we use the word like dissolves like. Does water dissolve fat? Does oil dissolve in water? No, it floats on top. So the answer is not B. Lipids are not like water molecules. In fact, they are nonpolar. So again, we didn't cover this yet. In fact, that was what I covered this morning with this morning's class. So I gave you that point. As you look in the grade book, you'll see that your grades have gone up. Okay? That's one more question that we had not covered. So far, that's two. Do y'all agree that everything else had to do with what we talked about in class? Okay. Here's the amino acid that I just drew a minute ago, and they don't draw out the connections. You see the R group here, 1, 2. Here they're put together. This is, remember I even outlined in class, I said this is the peptide bond between the two amino acids. I said these are the R groups, these are your variables. Okay. So this is a what? What two amino acids put together? It's a peptide bond. This is a what kind of peptide? Two of them put together is a what? Again, this is right out of your study guide, literally right out of your study guide. If you were confused, I ask again, why don't you come to tutoring? Just as a question. Or ask a question in class even. So two peptides bonded together by a peptide bond, what do we call them? Two amino acids connected by a peptide bond. Say it. Someone said something. I can't hear you. All right, it's a dipeptide. So just like a disaccharide, that was literally the example in the study guide. So it's called the dipeptide. Just like I drew two sugars coming together earlier on the previous page, here we're putting two amino acids together. The prefix di means two. The prefix di means two, like bi, bi, di, they both mean two. Tri means three. Quad means four. Right? Yes? We're okay with that? All right. And I did discuss that in class as we went over the answer in the study guide. So here we have, that's what they give you. That's before we even get to the question. The illustration above shows the formation molecule A from joining two amino acids 1 and 2 together. This is a what? Is it a disaccharide? Is it a disaccharide? Is this a disaccharide? What's a saccharide?
Sugar.
Sugar. So is it two sugars? Is two amino acids two sugars?
No,
It's two protein. Two amino acids. They're involved with proteins, not sugars. So if you're not clear on that, you got to get clear. Saccharides means sugar. Carbohydrates and proteins are different. They have different elements in them. They have different structures. You got to know this. This explains, by the way, when you're reviewing like this and you're doing an item analysis, you have to ask yourself, this is what, you have to come to that reflective piece where you have to reflect and say, this is why I didn't do well. I'm confused about this. So I got to get this straight in my head. If you're laying your head down and sleeping while we're reviewing for the test, then that just kind of defeats any argument you have about doing badly. So is this a nucleic acid? I just drew a nucleic acid for you. Is it? No, it's not. So it's not a nucleic acid. It's not a disaccharide. Is it a fatty acid? Is this a fatty acid? What are fatty acids? Somebody said, you made us draw fatty acids over and over again. You drew them on the board over and over again. And it wasn't on the test. Okay, well, what we did is we said a fatty acid looks like something like this. And it's a long chain of carbons. And they're called fatty acids. And either they're saturated or unsaturated. And they can be involved in triglycerides, and they can be connected to a glycerol molecule. And we call these molecules, these kinds of molecules with these structures, mostly carbon and hydrogen. We don't call them proteins. We don't call them nucleic acids. We don't call them carbohydrates. We call them lipids. So it's a fatty acid is a form of a lipid. So does a fatty acid have does a fatty acid have nitrogen? No. Does this have nitrogen? Yes. Nitrogen. So it's not a nucleic acid because a nucleic acid has the ribose sugar, nitrogenous base, a phosphate group. There's no phosphate here. The structure looks essentially different. So there's absolutely no question that it's not a disaccharide because it's not a sugar. It's not a nucleic acid because there's no phosphate. It's not a fatty acid because it has nitrogen. So what's the only choice? The only choice is polypeptide. I would argue it's wrong. A polypeptide is not. This is a dipeptide, but I'm not going to argue details. It's the only answer that's available. Lipids are good energy storage molecules because this one I gave you because you would not know the answer to. This was an unfair question. As I went over it, after I printed it, I said, oh my gosh, I can't believe I gave him this question. So this is the one, this is the answer. You'll know more about that when we go into energetics. You don't have to worry about that now. If you got it right, I did give it to you, as I said. Go look at your grades in the grade book, and you'll see you've gotten 100 points more than you had as of yesterday in the grade book. Is that clear? So I did give you your improved grade. Which of the following is a macromolecule? A macromolecule, as I told you, I did write on the test for you, macromolecule means big molecule. It's, in our case, you can take it as being analogous to polymer. It could be a large lipid, but let's just call it a polymer. So it could be like, all right. So which of the following is a macromolecule? Is it glucose? Glucose is a single monomer. You take a bunch of monomers and you put them together to make what? A what? A polymer. A carbohydrate, complex carbohydrate, long chain of sugars. So the answer for that one is certainly not glucose because that's a monomer, not a polymer. So it's not glucose. Is it an amino acid? No, because it's a monomer, that amino acid is a monomer, not a polymer. Is it water? No, water's a small molecule, just 3 atoms. It's certainly not a big molecule. And so is a protein a polymer? Yes. Is that the answer? Yes, it is. Again, covered in class very much the way I just showed you. Last 2 questions before the problem. Which of these is a true statement? These were given to you because we haven't talked about it in class, even though you did read it in the chapter. I'm not even going to, well, I might as well just give you the answer. Which is true statement? Enzyme activity between pH and enzyme action. And that's D. And the enzyme catalyzes a chemical reaction. It's converted, it's restored to its original state. And we'll talk more about that next week. Let's move on to the problem, which I think, oh wait, there's one more of these. Huh? So here, this one was asking you, there's a whole setup. This again was a combination, chapter 1 and chapter 6. He'll give you an experiment that asked you, okay, so we grew these plants in potting soil and we grew these plants in sawdust. They told you sawdust only has this word. They said cellulose. Cellulose is a carbohydrate. You should know that, correct? I expect that you know that. If you don't know that, well, you need to go back and review, take better notes and review them, recite them, etc. A carbohydrate's mostly CH&O, only CH&O, at a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. I said that 3 times just today and about 100 times over the last few weeks. 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. Only carbon and hydrogen. So if I'm growing a plant the way you've been growing in class, this little seed, in a pot that only has sawdust in it. So it only has what elements? C, H, and O. Which of these molecules could it not grow? Could it, which of these elements is missing? Which of these monomers would it not be able to make in order to build itself? So could it make A? Could it make A?
Yes.
Yes, because it's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. So it's not A. Could it make B? No, it couldn't. Why not? Nitrogen. It has no nitrogen. It's only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Where's the nitrogen come from? Nowhere. It can't build it. But this is what makes this one wrong only. Because there's another molecule, another biomolecule in here it cannot make. What is it? This is an amino acid. What's the other one? The one that I drew for you. A nucleotide. It's going to have a hard time building nucleotides and amino acids. And because of that, the answer is C. It can't make the nucleotide here, but it can make this, so it's not both of these. So that's why D's wrong. All right, so let's go to the problem. Here's the problem. They tell you there's 3 test tubes or 4 test tubes. It's easy, just draw 4 test tubes. Some of you drew it. Oh, is it time to go? All right. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm just trying to help you get a better grade. My bad.
You want us to take these?
Yeah, you. All right, so there were 4 test tubes here, and they tell you in the problem that these 4 test tubes had different materials, and they give you a description of each of these. In the first one, they say the test tube, test tube contains nitrogen, oh, let me make that smaller. The first test, the 2 and 4 contain nitrogen, but the others don't. So 2 and 4 have nitrogen, and the others don't. Okay, so right away, I think what comes to my mind is what we discussed in class repeatedly, which is there's two biomolecules. Let's just write out the one thing you need to know to be able to answer these questions quickly. One is that carbohydrates have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And in fact, we talked about, I want to say 7 times, I don't know how many times it is today, a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. We know that lipids also have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they're mostly carbon and hydrogen with a small amount of oxygen. Then we have proteins that have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and some sulfur. And then usually sulfur is left out, but I think it's important to discuss it for future reference. And then the last is nucleic acids, which have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, no sulfur, but instead they have phosphorus. So these nucleic acids, the proteins, the lipids, the carbohydrates, there's 4 biomolecules, 4 macromolecules, 4 polymers that could be in these test tubes. So these have 2 and 4 have nitrogen. I don't know about you, but to me that says clearly it has to be either proteins or nucleic acids because they're the only ones that have nitrogen. The contents of the test tube 3 are not soluble in water, but the contents of the others are. So 3 is not soluble. So this one here is insoluble, which means it's not going to dissolve. It doesn't dissolve in water. Well, which of these biomolecules do we know doesn't dissolve in water? I want to remind you that lipids include oils, fats, fatty acids, steroids, and I think it's pretty clear that lipids are not soluble in water. I want you to remember the idea that oil floats on water. Oil floats on water. It doesn't get dissolved by water. So I hope that at this point you understand lipids, 3 is lipids. 2 and 4 are either nitrogen, are either proteins or nucleic acids. Number 3 says contents of 1 can be broken down into identical subunits. So there's again 4 biomolecules. We know from what we talked about, carbohydrates can form polymers. We know lipids do not form polymers. There's no monomers you can break them down into. Proteins have monomers, yes, they are polymers. They have monomers, but their monomers have 20 different monomers. So they're not identical. 20 different. And nucleic acids are also polymers, yes. They have monomers, yes. But we talked about there being 4 different ones, different monomers for DNA, and then 4 different monomers for RNA. We said in DNA you have A, T, G, and C, and in RNA you have A, U, G, and C. So to be clear, nucleic acids have different polymers and monomers. Proteins have different monomers. So the monomers can be different. They can have different functions, etc. Carbohydrates, though, when you're talking about the polymers of carbohydrates, like cellulose, like glycogen, which we discussed in class, cellulose, glycogen, and others, but I think we talked starch. So those are all made of identical monomers. The only ones that of these polymers, so again, the only ones that have polymers are proteins, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. Of those three, only carbohydrates have identical monomers. So this is carbohydrate. All right, the molecule in test tube 2 contains phosphorus. So this has nitrogen and phosphorus. So what possible molecule could that be? Which of these has nitrogen and phosphorus? It can only be nucleic acids. So that one turns out to be nucleic acids. Because it has nitrogen and phosphorus, where 4 only has nitrogen, so it would have to be proteins. If it was a nucleic acid, it would definitely have phosphate. All right, and that's why these 4 answers are the way they are. The question is, did we cover this material? Yes. What is it, a simple memorization question? No. You had to work your way through the problem, use your critical thinking skills and the content that you should have known to answer these problems. Could you have done it? Yes, I believe you can. I know you can. So let's work on that. All right.